A human being perceives reality at a highly specific, localized scale. When we process the true dimensions of the universe, our cognitive frameworks fail. Astronauts observe this failure firsthand. When they view the Earth suspended against the absolute void of space, they consistently report a severe cognitive shift. Their sense of individual identity shrinks, and their internal model of humanity's place in the universe is completely rewritten. Psychologists call this the overview effect. This disorientation isn't limited to physical vastness. Modern physics introduces a profound structural uncertainty. At the subatomic level, reality is entirely probabilistic. The equations of Werner Heisenberg demonstrate that the universe operates on quantum indeterminacy, not mechanical certainty. Theoretical physicists push this further. Max Tegmark's mathematical multiverse hypothesis posits that our reality is merely one of an infinite number of random permutations, each governed by completely different physical laws. These models arrive at the same conclusion: the cosmos lacks inherent teleology. There is no preordained design, no directed goal, and no universal purpose written into the fabric of space. This creates acute friction. The human brain evolved as a rigorous meaning-seeking engine. When it attempts to process an environment that is scientifically purposeless, the resulting cognitive dissonance is immense. To prevent this dissonance from causing psychological paralysis, the human mind does not simply shut down in the face of nihilism. It executes a highly adaptive cognitive protocol. The first phase of this protocol is entirely biological, an involuntary affective response triggered by massive physical or social scale. We recognize this emotional state as awe. This diagram illustrates how that biological response feeds into the second phase, a cognitive processing loop. Track A represents the biological input, parsing the sensory data of the cosmos. Track B shows how the brain uses that input to run a dynamic feedback loop. Subjective meaning is a structured biological and psychological output. It is the specific product of a brain actively resolving the tension of scale. Psychologists define awe strictly. It is an emotional response to novel complexity on a scale that defies your current frame of reference. It requires a physical or conceptual massiveness that forces you to realize your own insignificance, making it entirely distinct from standard positive emotions like happiness. This realization carries distinct physiological markers. Encountering massive scale activates the parasympathetic nervous system. It physically forces your heart rate and breathing to synchronize, overriding the body's standard stress response and forcing a state of calm. As the body calms, the mind shifts its focus outward. Psychologists document this as the small self phenomenon, a measurable reduction in ego and personal concerns. This animation represents the exact moment of schema accommodation. When the brain encounters an input too massive for its current worldview, it cannot reject the data. It is forced to break apart its existing knowledge frameworks and reform them to contain the new complexity. With the ego diminished and the schema updated, the behavioral output changes. Research by Datcher Keltner demonstrates that awe directly increases ethical decision-making and cooperative social engagement. In clinical studies, children aged 8 to 13 who were shown awe-inspiring footage of vast nature scenes spent significantly more time on helpful tasks than control groups. Following the exercise, they were measurably more likely to donate their own experiment earnings to refugees. The biological confrontation with our own insignificance does not lead to nihilistic paralysis. It physically rewires the nervous system to be calmer, more willing to integrate new information, and highly oriented toward helping the collective. This exact schema-breaking mechanism operates beyond physical scale. It is also triggered by massive psychological or philosophical shifts. In clinical literature, this is identified as the existential crisis. This is the moment a person's internal framework collapses, typically induced by trauma, profound loss, or the sudden realization of cosmic indifference. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre argued that because human beings are born without a predetermined essence, we are condemned to be free. Without external instructions, the burden of defining our existence falls entirely on us. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl proved that this burden can be managed through logotherapy. He argued that human survival requires the active construction of meaning, particularly when confronting severe suffering. Frankl tested this premise in maximum adversity environments. Surviving the brutality of Nazi concentration camps, he observed that prisoners who successfully generated an internal locus of meaning, whether through a commitment to loved ones or a vision of the future, retained their psychological resilience, while those waiting for external meaning to save them quickly perished. An existential crisis is a structural collapse, but it is not a failure state. It is the mandatory initial input required to engage the brain's internal manufacturing engine. We can map this engine using the dynamic recursive model developed by researcher Elie Shervani. This block diagram starts with that structural collapse, the input variable ET, representing the existential crisis. The presence of ET forces the activation of the next variable, CT, coping. This represents the immediate psychological effort expended to process the crisis. Sustained coping stimulates the third variable, GT, or personal growth. The process of managing the trauma directly alters and expands the individual's worldview. Growth acts as the strict prerequisite for the fourth variable, MT, meaning construction. Only after the schema has expanded can the individual build a new, localized purpose. Notice how this process maps cleanly onto a sigmoid curve. Meaning generation is mathematically bounded because human psychological adaptation is gradual. It requires time and friction to progress from input to output. Human biology synthesizes purpose under pressure. Meaning acts as a manufactured output of the brain's internal friction. There is a sharp contrast between the vastness of the natural cosmos and the artificial vastness we encounter today. Modern connectivity forces rapid, disjointed information flow. This generates chronic digital stress, completely stripping the brain of the reflective silence and time required to complete the process of schema accommodation. Researchers call this algorithmic existentialism. Users feel their self-worth and emotional states are being directed by indifferent digital systems that offer endless data but zero structural framework. By continuously resetting the user's attention, the digital environment traps individuals in the coping phase. The brain is forced to process an endless stream of microcrises, preventing it from ever progressing to the growth stage where meaning is actually constructed. Algorithmic disruption of internal cognitive loops represents a more immediate threat to meaning-making than the physical emptiness of space. To successfully navigate the overview effect, the two systems have to run sequentially. Awe acts as the biological primer. It shrinks the ego and clears the cognitive cache, creating the exact physical conditions required for the brain's recursive meaning-making loop to function. Returning to Shervani's block diagram, we find the final variable. Meaning construction outputs directly to P, psychological well-being. The system operates recursively. Well-being feeds back into the start of the circuit, fortifying the individual's baseline resilience for the next inevitable crisis. A universe without a pre-written script provides the necessary environment for human freedom. Because the cosmos is indifferent, we possess the autonomy to assign absolute value to our own actions. Encountering a massive, indifferent universe does not demand despair. It is the exact trigger required to start an elegant biological engine, evolved specifically to forge meaning out of the void.